Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in round 12 of our coverage of the 2016 Candidates Tournament. Winner of this tournament does go on to face Magnus Carlsen in November for the World Championships. It seems like for the past 5 or 6 rounds that we've had a 3 to 4 man race with everyone just taking turns being at the top of the leaderboard. In round 11, we had a pretty epic match. We had Vishy Anand take on Sergei Karyakin, two of the top players. Vishy Anand came out on top. So coming into this round, Vishy Anand and Fabiano Caruana are tied for first, and Sergei Karyakin is only a half a point behind them. So today's match, White's going to be played by Nakamura from the United States, although in theory out of contention for first, just way too far behind. Wants to make at least a decent showing these last 3 rounds. We do play 14 rounds in this tournament. Just not having a good tournament so far, though. He's going to be playing the white pieces. His opponent, Vishy Anand, playing the black pieces, looking to kind of solidify his spot at the top of the leaderboard. So we'll go ahead and get into it. Starts out with pawn to c4, the English opening. Pawn e5, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6. And we saw a very similar match early on in the tournament. If you haven't kind of watched some of the earlier rounds, if you watched Topalov versus Levan Aronian, they played a very similar match, even upwards to the first 8 or so moves. So we'll kind of go through pawn to g3, fianchetto, the bishop on the king side, bishop down here at b4 attacking the knight. Now the knight's going to come up here to d5. And then pawn to e4. Just such an awkward spot for white to immediately have to worry about this pawn all up in his business over here with this knight. A really, really nice support. So knight over here to h4. Castle on the king side, bishop here g2. Pawn d6, and then pawn a3. And this is the first deviation from the Topalov-Aronian game that we saw early on. And you can be assured that both the players in this tournament, the 8 contenders, but also their team. So usually they bring some people with them that are watching the other games. They've studied with them for months coming up into this tournament. They've seen all the previous stuff. They've looked at different variations and see if they can find small little tweaks. And so my guess is they studied this particular game and saw, okay, pawn to a3 is probably a better move. In that particular game, Topalov played a knight to b4 and then knight recaptured here on b4. Topalov would go on to lose the game as white. So Nakamura kind of looked at that and said pawn to a3 I think is a better variation. So after pawn to a3, bishop back here to c5, castle on the king side, and then rook here to e8. Just solidifying more so on this pawn on e4. Very important piece for Vishy Anand in the center of the board. Nakamura continues pawn e3, and then pawn g5. Pretty aggressive move from Vishy Anand, extending his protection in front of his king to have a nice little attack on the knight here on h4. And this knight on h4 can't really go anywhere. It'd like to kind of retreat back to f3. This is the normal square for the knight, controlling the center of the board, but there's this pawn here on e4 is just so difficult to deal with. It can't come here to g6 clearly because the pawns can't come here to f5 because the light square bishop for black would just take it. So all in all, Nakamura's in a tough spot, but he does have the option to counterattack his opponent. So that's really the only thing that he can do right now. He starts out with pawn to b4, forcing the bishop to come back here, and then bishop to b2. If we look at, there's a few options. I'll go through some of them and why they're all bad, but he could decide just to go ahead and take here on b6. If he takes on b6, then the pawn takes here on b6, and then white has to move, and there's no more threats that he can really do. This knight is going to fall on board. There's that option. The other option is to go ahead and take here on f6. The problem there is, all of a sudden the queen's going to come, take on f6. This is going to be extremely bad. The knight's going to fall. There's just no way to really combat this. But instead, he could play bishop here to b2. And that stops some of the stuff because the pawn can't just take on h4, because now knight, the bishop could take, or even more powerful than that, the knight could take here on f6, check, forking this rook here on e8. It is being protected by the bishop, so the queen can't take it. And then if we see king to f8, king to h8 just gets crazier because there's a discovered attack once the knight moves. But if we see king to f8, then all of a sudden knight h7, check, As the king comes back, potentially knight f6, we could continue this, but then all of a sudden the queen's going to get involved into the game. It gets really, really bad. There's just no protection over here for black, so he can't take that knight right away here on h4. So he has to kind of figure out what he is going to do on board. He decides to go ahead and take this knight here on d5, which is great. Nakamura can respond. Pawn takes here on d5, and then, hey, if you want to take my knight, that's going to be completely okay. I'll take your knight, and then I'm not down in material. So this is really the only way that Nakamura had to continue. And so Vishy Anand has some options here as far as how he continues. There's two main moves. He could play knight to e5. Nice little outpost here. He does have a pawn protection, so if the bishop does want to take, that's going to be completely okay. He also has the ability to come down here to d4. He knows that he's probably going to lose his knight, but that's okay because he's going to gain a knight over here. He probably chooses the worst of the two options. He plays knight to d4. It's not on an outpost at all. And I really just don't like this move in general. Just allows his opponent to take it. But Nakamura decides to first play pawn to d3. He knows that he can take this knight if he wants to. There's no way really around that if he wants to try to hold on to it. Knight coming back here to b5 isn't going to work because just pawn to a4. The knight's still going to fall. So he recognized this and said, I can just have a little in-between move. Pawn to d3 first. Then we see the pawn take on h4. Pawn first take on e4. He knows this knight is still his whenever he wants it. So the knight's going to come back here to e6. Pawn takes on e6, and then rook comes down here to e6. Does not want to lose another pawn in front of his king, so instead decides to go ahead and take with his rook here on e6. And then pawn pushing forward to e5. And this is another nice little move from Nakamura as it pushed forward in the center of the board. The pawn can't take here because the queen's going to take up here on d8. That's going to be extremely bad. This does open up the door for the light square bishop to get involved into the game, and all of a sudden white's doing a better job of controlling the center of the board. As soon as this pawn takes, all of a sudden this dark square bishop is going to be just barreling down on his opponent. You can see this dark square bishop, it has two pawns to get through before it's really putting a lot of pressure on his opponent. So Nakamura definitely has much more defense in front of his king, where Vishy Anand, although he had a nice little attack, all of a sudden it kind of looks like he's going to have a lot of pain coming his way as far as an attack from Nakamura. So after the pawn takes, the pawn recaptures here from the h pawn. It is a little worse just if you take with your pawn on g3. The queen comes down here to g5. Double attack with the bishop and the queen here. The pawn can't move, so pretty much the bishop's going to come down here to e3. Just in a tough spot for Nakamura. So he correctly decides to go ahead and take with his h-pawn. Now the queen comes down to g5, but it's not nearly as strong as an attack since this pawn on f2 is protecting that. The pawn does take on d6. The rook's going to capture here, and then queen to b3. So starting to line up a lot of his material against his opponent's king side, which is somewhat decimated right now. The light square bishop still has not got involved. This rook over here on a8 is not doing anything on board. Pawn to h5. I really don't like this move from Vishy Anand. I don't understand why he decides to take his already tough position. He has to deal with so much and extend his pawns even further. I think it's time to kind of buckle down. You're tied in material, but you probably have a worse position. Play rook over here, h6, protect it, keep the pawns on the 7th rank, don't increase them any further down the path. But instead, we see pawn to h5, looking to kind of blow up on the king side of the board. Rook here to d1, attacking the rook, and then rook to h6. Another move I don't necessarily like. I think if you're going to play pawn to h5, you got to just commit. Continue down the board, pawn to h4, and let's just go with it. But rook to h6, I mean, usually once your rook's behind your pawns, if they're in the center of the board and you're kind of pushing it up and you're trying to, protect that. But over here on the h file, that's not necessarily what you're looking to do, especially when your opponent's just going to be very, very aggressively attacking. Rook here to d5, so Nakamura starts to attack the queen. And now it is essentially just get the pieces involved into the game as much as possible. Queen here to c4, just solidifying his position a little bit more, allowing himself to get his queen involved over to the king side, getting the attack. Bishop down to g4. I like the light square bishop involved into the action. I also like it involved 10 moves ago. Right now, it's not doing a whole heck of a lot. Queen over here, f4. Rook g6, just trying to add a little bit of protection to the king side. But then rook to e5, forcing the queen to move. And then bishop to e4, attacking the rook. There's just too much going on. Once this rook can get more involved into the game, we have too many attacks. This dark square bishop here is just too powerful. In this particular spot, Vishy Anand decided to go ahead and resign. So kind of crazy. The last 4 matches Vishy Anand have had, he's won 2 and lost 2. Dude's not trying to draw at all. So kudos to him for having some exciting games. You have someone like Anish Giri who has tied every round. Every single round. Anand, he's going for glory. Now, sometimes he does resign a little bit earlier if he doesn't like the position that he's in, like today, although it is definitely a losing position. But all in all, his matches are exciting. So, Vishy Anand drops back in the standings. He did not improve at all. Sergey Karyakin, he won today. So, he lost yesterday to Vishy Anand. He won today. So, he is now tied in first place with Fabiano Caruana, who tied today. So, in the lead, we have Sergey and we have Fabiano, and then half a point behind them, we have Vishy Anand. So that's pretty much the 3-man race. One of those is more than likely going to win the tournament. So last 2 rounds are going to be very, very critical. So make sure you definitely check those out, round 13 and 14. And then we will crown a champion, and that player will go on to play Magnus Carlsen. So hopefully you guys enjoy this match. Definitely a more exciting game than I was expecting out of the English opening. But thanks everyone for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.